There is a quiet fear that lives in most people, a fear so deeply programmed, so socially reinforced, that it shapes entire lives without ever being questioned. It whispers one simple belief: debt is dangerous. Debt is a trap. Debt will ruin you. And because of that belief, millions of people spend their entire lives running, not building, avoiding, not understanding, surviving, instead of expanding. But what if I told you that the very thing you've been taught to fear is the same thing used by those who quietly build empires? What if the difference between financial struggle and financial freedom is not income, not intelligence, but how you understand one word: debt? In this audiobook, How Debt Can Generate Income, Use a Debt Wisely, you're going to unlearn what keeps you small and relearn what builds leverage. You will discover the hidden structure behind how wealth is created in the modern world. You will understand why some people are crushed by debt, while others use it as a tool to multiply their income, their opportunities, and their freedom. We will walk through 25 chapters together, from mindset to strategy to emotional discipline to real-world application. You will learn the difference between destructive debt and strategic debt. You will learn how money flows, how assets work, how leverage multiplies results, and how discipline protects you from collapse. And most importantly, you will learn how to think differently. Because this is not just about money. This is about control. This is about awareness. This is about stepping out of survival mode and stepping into intentional growth. But before we go any further, understand this clearly. This audiobook is educational. It is not financial advice. Every decision you make carries risk, and responsibility always stays with you, because power without responsibility is destruction, and debt, used without understanding, is exactly that. Here is your first truth, the one that will echo through every chapter you're about to hear. Debt doesn't make you poor. Misunderstanding debt does. Let that sit with you, because everything changes when you stop asking, "How do I avoid debt?" and start asking, "How do I use it?" That shift alone separates two completely different lives. One life stays small, safe, and limited. The other expands, builds, and multiplies. Now imagine this. Two people, same age, same income, same opportunities. One avoids debt completely. The other learns how to use it. 10 years later, their lives look nothing alike. Not because one worked harder, but because one understood leverage and the other didn't. This audiobook will show you why. And as you listen, don't just hear the words. Question your beliefs. Challenge your assumptions. Because the biggest barrier between where you are and where you could be is not money. It's mindset. If this message resonates with you at any point, take a moment and commit to yourself. Not to me, to yourself. Because growth only begins when you decide to take ownership. And if a line hits you, if something shifts inside you, share it. Write it down. Speak it into existence. Because awareness is the beginning of control. Now, take a breath, clear your mind, and prepare yourself for Chapter 1. Because before you can use debt, you need to understand why you were taught to fear it in the first place, and that story is not what you think. Chapter 1. The fear you inherited. You were not born afraid of debt. You were taught to be. Think about that for a moment. No child looks at money and says, "I should avoid borrowing forever." No child understands interest rates, leverage, or financial systems. That fear, that hesitation, that automatic resistance, it was installed. Installed slowly, quietly, repeated through years of conversations, warnings, and experiences you didn't even question. Stay out of debt. Debt will ruin your life. Only fools borrow money. And for many people, those statements feel true because they've seen the consequences. They've seen families crushed under credit card balances. They've seen people trapped by loans they didn't understand. They've seen stress, arguments, sleepless nights. So the mind creates a rule: avoid debt at all costs. And on the surface, that sounds wise. But here's the problem. That rule is incomplete because it doesn't distinguish between types of debt. It doesn't explain context. It doesn't teach strategy. It only teaches fear. And fear blocks understanding. You see, most people don't fail financially because they lack opportunity. They fail because they operate on half-truths. And one of the biggest half-truths is this idea that all debt is bad. Even in the competitive materials you studied, there's a recurring pattern. The distinction between good debt and bad debt keeps appearing. That idea matters more than most people realize, because without that distinction, you're blind. Let's slow this down. There are two completely different realities that exist under the same word: debt. One destroys, the other builds. One drains your future, the other accelerates it. But if you treat them the same, you either fall into chaos or you stay stuck in limitation. Neither leads to freedom. Imagine someone using a credit card to buy things they don't need: clothes to impress people, gadgets for temporary excitement, experiences they cannot afford. That debt produces nothing. It creates no income, no return, no growth. It only creates pressure. That is consumption debt. And it is the type most people experience. Now imagine something different. Someone borrows money, not to consume, but to acquire something that produces income, an asset, something that pays them back month after month, year after year. That is a completely different game. And yet, both are called debt. This is where most people get lost, because they judge the tool without understanding how it's used. A knife can prepare a meal or cause harm. The tool is neutral. The outcome depends on the user. Debt works the same way. And the wealthy understand this deeply. They don't ask, "How do I avoid debt?" They ask, "How do I control it?" That one shift changes everything, because control requires knowledge, and knowledge removes fear. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable. Avoiding debt completely might feel safe, but safety often comes with a hidden cost: limitation. Because when you refuse to use leverage, you rely only on what you currently have: your current income, your current savings, your current capacity. And growth becomes slow, painfully slow. Meanwhile, others are using leverage to accelerate, to expand faster than their current resources would allow, to acquire assets earlier, to build momentum sooner, and over time, that difference compounds. This is not theory. This is how systems work. Money moves differently for people who understand leverage. Now pause for a second. Ask yourself honestly, what do you feel when you hear the word debt? Tension? Fear? Resistance? Or curiosity? Because your answer reveals your current relationship with it. And that relationship determines your behavior. Most people never question it. They just follow the pattern they inherited. But you're here now, which means something inside you is asking a different question. Not, is debt bad, but am I missing something? That question is powerful, because it opens the door to awareness, and awareness is where transformation begins. Here's a line I want you to remember. The same tool that destroys the careless builds the disciplined. Debt is not dangerous to those who understand it. It is dangerous to those who don't. And that's why this audiobook matters. Because we're not just talking about money. We're talking about awareness, control, discipline, the ability to think independently. Because if you don't control your financial decisions, someone else will benefit from them. Banks, systems, markets, they all operate on structure. And if you don't understand that structure, you become part of it without realizing it. So chapter 1 is not about teaching you how to use debt yet. It's about removing the blindfold, breaking the automatic fear, separating emotion from understanding. Because you cannot use something wisely if you're afraid to even look at it. And as we move into chapter 2, we're going to go deeper into the real difference between good debt and bad debt, not as a simple definition, but as a framework, a way of thinking, a filter that will change how you evaluate every financial decision moving forward. Because once you see the difference clearly, you can never unsee it. And that's where the real shift begins. Chapter 2. The two worlds hidden inside one word. Debt. One word. Two completely different outcomes. And if you don't separate them clearly, you will either fear everything or misuse everything. There is no middle ground for the uninformed. So let's slow this down and build a lens you will carry for the rest of your life. Because once you understand this, every financial decision becomes clearer. Every opportunity becomes easier to evaluate, and every mistake becomes avoidable. There are two types of debt, not in theory, not in textbooks, but in real life. Debt that takes from you and debt that gives to you. Debt that drains, and debt that produces, debt that traps, and debt that builds. Let's start with the first one, the one most people know too well. Consumption debt. This is the debt that exists for one reason: to satisfy a desire, not to create value, not to generate income, but to feel something now. A better phone, a nicer car, clothes that signal status, experiences that impress others. None of these are inherently wrong, but when they are funded by borrowed money without a return, they create a quiet problem because the excitement is temporary. But the obligation is long-term. You feel good for a moment, but you pay for it for months, sometimes years. That imbalance is where stress begins. And this is why so many people associate debt with pain. Because this is the only type of debt they've experienced. They borrow, they consume, they repay, and nothing grows, no income, no asset, no leverage, just pressure. Now here's the shift. The second type of debt works completely differently. This is strategic debt. This is where things begin to change, because now the purpose is not consumption, it's acquisition. Not things that lose value, but things that produce value, assets. Something that pays you, something that generates income, something that continues working even when you're not. This is where the conversation changes completely, because now debt is no longer a burden. It becomes a tool, a bridge, a way to access opportunities earlier instead of waiting years to afford them. Even in the material you reviewed, this idea appears clearly. Borrowing to acquire something that generates income creates a completely different outcome. But here's where most people get confused. They hear this idea, and they think it's easy. It's not. Because Strategic debt requires discipline. It requires clarity. It requires emotional control. Without those, it quickly turns back into consumption debt, and that's where people get hurt. So let's build a simple filter, a question you must ask every time you consider using debt. One question. Simple, but powerful. Will this debt pay for itself? If the answer is no, you are entering consumption. If the answer is yes, you are stepping into strategy. Now don't rush this, because this question alone can save you years of stress. Let's go deeper. Imagine borrowing money to buy something that generates monthly income. That income covers the cost of the debt and leaves something extra. Now the debt is not costing you, it's being carried by the asset itself. That is the foundation of leverage. And this is where the wealthy think differently. They don't focus only on the cost of debt. They focus on what the debt allows them to control. Because control creates opportunity. Opportunity creates income. Income creates freedom. It's a chain reaction. But only if the foundation is correct. And here's the truth most people don't hear. Strategic debt is not about taking more risk. It's about managing risk differently. Because every decision carries risk. Even avoiding debt carries risk. The risk of slow growth, the risk of missed opportunities, the risk of staying dependent on one income source. So the real question is not, is debt risky? The real question is, which risk are you choosing? Because doing nothing is still a decision, and that decision has consequences. Now let's ground this in reality. In today's world, 2025 and beyond, opportunities move fast. Digital assets, online businesses, real estate markets, technology, access to capital, everything is accelerating, and those who understand leverage move with that speed, while others wait, save, delay, and hope to catch up later. But time is the one resource you cannot recover, and this is why strategic debt exists, not to trap you, but to accelerate you, if used correctly. Let me give you a line to hold on to. Bad debt buys comfort. Good debt buys freedom. Read that again, slowly, because it's not about the money. It's about the intention behind it. And intention shapes outcome. Now here's where things get deeper, because understanding the difference is only the beginning. The real challenge is emotional control. Because even if you understand everything we just discussed, if you cannot control your impulses, you will still make the wrong decisions. You will still justify consumption as investment. You will still blur the line. And that's where discipline becomes everything. Not knowledge, not intelligence, discipline. Because money follows behavior, always. And behavior follows mindset. Which is why this audiobook is not just about strategy. It's about who you become. Because the person who uses debt wisely thinks differently, acts differently, decides differently. And in Chapter 3, we are going to go deeper into that identity, the mindset of people who use debt to build instead of destroy. Because before you ever touch strategy, you need to understand how they think, and that thinking will challenge everything you've been taught. Chapter 3, the mindset that multiplies money. Before strategy, before numbers, before deals, there is something far more important, the way you think, because two people can have access to the exact same opportunity, the exact same resources, the exact same information, and still end up in completely different realities. Why? Because one sees risk and the other sees leverage. One sees pressure and the other sees potential. One hesitates, the other calculates. This is not luck. This is not talent. This is mindset. And the truth is, most people never upgrade it. They upgrade their phones. They upgrade their cars. They upgrade their lifestyles. But they never upgrade the way they think about money. And because of that, they stay stuck in the same patterns, repeating the same mistakes, living the same financial cycles over and over again. Now listen carefully. People who use debt to build wealth do not think like consumers. They think like operators. They think like builders. They think like people who understand systems. And that difference changes everything. Let's break this down. The average person looks at money and thinks in terms of spending. What can I afford? How much does this cost? Can I pay for this right now? But someone who understands leverage thinks differently. They ask, what does this produce? What does this return? How does this grow over time? Do you see the shift? One mindset focuses on price. The other focuses on value. One focuses on the present moment. The other focuses on long-term outcomes, and that difference compounds quietly, relentlessly, over years. Now here's where it becomes uncomfortable, because this mindset requires you to delay gratification, to say no when it's easy to say yes, to think long-term in a world that rewards instant pleasure. And most people struggle with that because discipline is rare. And without discipline, even the best strategy fails. You can understand everything about good debt, but if you lack control, you will still fall into bad decisions, because knowledge without discipline is dangerous. Now let's go deeper. People who use debt wisely do not see money as something to protect. They see it as something to deploy, to use, to move, because idle money does nothing. It feels safe, but it doesn't grow, and growth requires movement. This is why the wealthy often don't rush to spend their own money. They protect it, they position it, they use other people's money strategically, not because they lack resources, but because they understand leverage. Even in real-world examples, you've seen situations where individuals with massive wealth still choose to borrow, because keeping their capital working elsewhere creates greater returns. That idea might sound strange at first. Why borrow if you already have money? Because the goal is not ownership. The goal is optimization. Let that sink in. It's not about having something fully paid off. It's about using your resources in the most efficient way possible. And sometimes that means letting your money work somewhere else, while borrowed money works here. That's leverage. But here's the part nobody talks about. This mindset is not comfortable. It goes against everything you were taught. It requires you to think differently. While everyone around you thinks the same, it requires you to trust your understanding when others question your decisions. And that takes strength, because most people follow the crowd. They follow what feels safe. They follow what sounds familiar, but familiarity does not create growth. It creates repetition. So if you want a different outcome, you need a different mindset. Now let's bring this back to you, because this is not about them, it's about you. Ask yourself, when you think about money, do you think like a consumer or like a builder? Do you focus on what things cost or what they can produce? Do you seek comfort or do you seek growth? There is no judgment here, only awareness, because awareness is the first step. Now here's a powerful line for you. Consumers spend money. Builders move money. And the moment you shift from spending to moving, everything begins to change. You stop chasing income and start creating systems. You stop reacting and start planning. You stop thinking small and start thinking in leverage. But this mindset comes with responsibility, because when you begin to use debt as a tool, mistakes become more expensive, decisions become more important, and discipline becomes non-negotiable. This is not a game. This is not quick money. This is structure. This is strategy. This is long-term thinking. And if you approach it casually, it will punish you. But if you approach it with clarity, it will reward you. Now, we are ready to go deeper, because understanding mindset is only the foundation. In Chapter 4, we step into the mechanics, how debt actually generates income, not theory, not surface-level ideas, but real practical flow, how money moves, how assets pay, how leverage multiplies, because once you understand that flow, you will start seeing opportunities where others see obstacles, and that is where everything begins to shift. Dear friend, you are definitely on the right track if you are watching this video. Like, subscribe, and write in the comments which topic or problem concerns you the most. We promise to prepare a professional video explanation at your request. Chapter 4. How debt actually generates income. Now we move from mindset into mechanics, because understanding how to think is powerful, but understanding how things work is what creates results. And this is where most people get lost. They hear phrases like, use debt to build wealth, but they never see the structure behind it, so it sounds abstract, complicated, out of reach. But the truth is, the mechanics are simple, not easy, but simple. So let's break it down, slowly. At its core, debt generates income when one condition is met. The money you borrow produces more money than it costs you. That's it. That's the entire game. But inside that simple statement is everything, because most people reverse it. They borrow money that costs them more than it produces, and that's where the problem begins. So let's walk through the flow. Step by step, you borrow money. That money is not the goal. It's the tool. You then use that money to acquire something, not anything, something that generates income, an asset. Now that asset produces cash flow, regular, predictable, consistent, and that cash flow pays for the debt. If done correctly, it doesn't just cover the cost, it exceeds it. And that difference is your profit. That is how debt generates income. Not magic, not luck. Structure. Now pause for a second, because this is where clarity matters. If the asset does not produce income, you are not investing. You are speculating. And speculation is a different game. Higher risk, less control, more uncertainty. So when we talk about using debt wisely, we are talking about income-producing assets, not guesses, not hopes, not trends. Structure. Now let's make this real. Imagine this flow in your mind. Money comes in from the asset. A portion goes out to cover the debt. What remains is yours. Now imagine that happening every month, while the asset continues to exist, while the debt continues to shrink, and eventually the debt disappears, but the asset remains, still producing, still paying. That is the long-term power of this model. You used borrowed money to acquire something that now pays you even after the debt is gone. That's leverage over time. Now here's the part most people overlook: time. Because this model is not about instant results. It's about sustained flow, month after month, year after year. And that's why patience matters. Because if you expect immediate returns, you will make emotional decisions. And emotional decisions break structure. Now let's go deeper. Because not all income is equal. Some income is active, some income is passive. And when using debt, the goal is to move toward income that does not depend on your time, because your time is limited, but assets can operate without you. And this is where freedom begins, not when you earn more, but when your income becomes less dependent on your effort. That's the shift. Now here's a powerful question. Is your income tied to your time or your assets? Because if it's tied only to your time, there's a ceiling, a limit, a point where you cannot scale further. But when assets enter the equation, that ceiling begins to disappear. And debt, used correctly, is one of the fastest ways to access those assets earlier. Instead of waiting years, saving slowly, missing opportunities, you accelerate. But again, only if the structure is correct. Now let's talk about risk, because this is where reality must stay grounded. Debt amplifies outcomes. If your decision is correct, it amplifies your gains. If your decision is wrong, it amplifies your losses. That's why discipline matters. That's why analysis matters. That's why emotion must be controlled. Because leverage does not forgive carelessness. It rewards precision. Now here's a line to remember. Debt is not dangerous because it exists. It's dangerous when it's misunderstood. And most people misunderstand the flow. They focus on borrowing, but ignore what happens after. They focus on access, but ignore structure. They focus on opportunity, but ignore sustainability. And that's where things collapse. So as you listen to this, don't rush, don't jump ahead. Build the foundation, understand the flow. Because once you truly understand how debt generates income, you will never look at money the same way again. Now here's something deeper, because this is not just about money. It's about control. When you understand this flow, you begin to see systems. You begin to see patterns. You begin to see how wealth is built quietly, not through luck, not through sudden success, but through structured decisions, repeated over time. And that awareness changes how you move, how you think, how you decide. Now take a moment. Reflect on this question. If I borrowed money today, would I know exactly how to make it produce income? Be honest, because honesty is where growth begins. If the answer is no, that's okay. That's why you're here. But by the end of this audiobook, that answer will change. Now in Chapter 5, we go even deeper, because understanding the mechanics is one thing, but choosing the right asset is everything. Because not all assets are equal, not all opportunities are real, and not everything that looks like income actually is. So in the next chapter, we break down what makes an asset truly valuable, and how to avoid the traps that look like opportunity but lead to loss. Because the difference between growth and failure often comes down to one decision, and that decision starts with what you choose. Chapter 5. What makes an asset worth the debt? Now we arrive at one of the most important turning points in this entire journey, because understanding how debt works is only half the equation. The other half is knowing what you are buying with it, because debt does not create value on its own. It only amplifies what you attach it to. And this is where many people fail, not because they don't understand debt, but because they choose the wrong asset. They chase trends. They follow hype. They react emotionally, and they confuse movement with value. So let's slow this down, because this chapter can save you years of mistakes. An asset is not something that simply exists. It is something that produces, something that generates value consistently, not once, not occasionally, but repeatedly. And here is the first rule. If it doesn't pay you, it's not an asset. It's a responsibility. That line alone can change your decisions forever, because many things look like assets, but behave like liabilities. They require maintenance. They require time. They require money, without giving anything back. And when you attach debt to something like that, you create pressure without return. That's how people get stuck. So what makes an asset worth the debt? There are three core characteristics: clarity, consistency, and control. Let's break them down. First, clarity. You must understand exactly how the asset generates income. Not vaguely, not it should work, not people say it's profitable. Clear, specific, measurable. Where does the money come from? Who is paying? Why are they paying? How often do they pay? If you cannot answer these questions clearly, you are not investing. You are guessing, and debt does not forgive guessing. Now second, consistency. Can this asset produce income regularly, or is it unpredictable? Because irregular income creates unstable pressure, and unstable pressure leads to poor decisions. You want flow, predictable, structured, reliable. Because when income is consistent, you can plan, you can manage, you can grow. But when income is chaotic, you react, you stress, you lose control. And control is everything. Now third, control. How much influence do you have over the outcome? Because some assets depend entirely on external factors, trends, markets, timing, luck. And while all investments carry some level of uncertainty, the more control you have, the more stable your position becomes. Control doesn't mean certainty. It means influence, the ability to adjust, to respond, to optimize. And when you combine clarity, consistency, and control, you create something powerful, a foundation. Now here's where most people make a critical mistake. They see potential, but ignore structure. They chase opportunity, but ignore sustainability. And that's why things collapse, because potential is not enough. Structure is what holds everything together. Let me give you a line to remember. An opportunity without structure is a risk in disguise, and debt attached to that magnifies the risk. Now let's go deeper, because in today's world, there are more opportunities than ever. Digital businesses, content platforms, e-commerce, freelance systems, real estate, investments. The list keeps growing, and that's both a blessing and a trap, because more options create more confusion, and confusion leads to poor decisions. So you need a filter, not just excitement, not just curiosity, a filter. And here it is. Does this asset solve a real problem? And does that solution create consistent income? Because income is always tied to value, always. People pay for solutions, not ideas, not intentions, solutions. So if what you are investing in does not solve something real, its income will always be unstable. Now here's something deeper, because the best assets do not just generate income, they scale, meaning they can grow without requiring equal growth in your time. That's where leverage multiplies. Because if something requires your constant effort, it limits expansion. But if something can grow beyond your direct involvement, it creates freedom. And this is where your thinking must evolve. You're not just looking for income, you're looking for scalable income. because that's what changes your life. Now pause and reflect on this question. Am I chasing income, or am I building systems that produce income? Because those are two different paths. One keeps you busy. The other builds leverage. And debt should only be used for the second. Now here's the truth. You will not get every decision right. Mistakes will happen. But the goal is not perfection. It's awareness, because awareness reduces mistakes and reduces risk and increases control. Now, if this is hitting you, if something is starting to shift in how you see money, take a moment. Commit to yourself. Not to rush, not to chase, but to think. Because thinking is what separates builders from followers. And if one line in this chapter stands out to you, hold on to it. Because clarity starts with one realization. Now we move forward, because choosing the right asset is only part of the equation. In Chapter 6, we step into something even deeper. Risk. Real risk. Not the fear-based version people talk about, but the structured reality behind it. Because if you don't understand risk, you will either avoid everything or walk blindly into danger, and neither leads to growth. So in the next chapter, we break down how to evaluate risk, control it, and use it to your advantage. Because the people who win are not the ones who avoid risk. They are the ones who understand it. Mate, write which city you're from. It's interesting to see which corners of the world are watching our videos. Chapter 6. Risk is not what you think. Most people hear the word risk and immediately feel resistance, fear, tension, uncertainty, because risk, in their mind, means danger, loss, failure, and because of that, they try to avoid it completely. But here's the truth that changes everything. You cannot build anything meaningful in life without risk. Not wealth, not growth, not freedom, nothing. The real difference is not between people who take risks and those who don't. It's between people who understand risk and those who don't. Because when you don't understand something, you either run from it or you walk straight into it blindly. And both paths lead to the same place, stagnation or loss. So let's rebuild your understanding, because risk is not the enemy. Ignorance is. Risk is simply uncertainty about an outcome. That's it. Nothing more, nothing less. And when you learn how to measure that uncertainty, you gain control. And control reduces fear. Now let's connect this to debt, because this is where things become real. Debt increases exposure. It magnifies outcomes. So if you make a strong decision, it accelerates your growth. If you make a weak decision, it accelerates your losses. That's why people fear it. Not because debt itself is dangerous, but because it reveals the quality of your decisions. Now here's the shift. Instead of asking, how do I avoid risk? You start asking, how do I understand and manage it? That question alone changes your entire approach, because now you're not reacting emotionally. You're thinking strategically. Let's break risk into something practical. 3 layers. The first is clarity risk. Do you truly understand what you are doing? Or are you relying on assumptions? Because most losses happen here. People move forward without full understanding. They hear something. They see potential. They act quickly, without clarity. And that's where mistakes begin. So before you ever use debt, you must ask, do I fully understand how this works? If the answer is no, you wait, you learn, you observe. Because speed without clarity creates damage. Now the second layer, cash flow risk. This is critical because even if the asset has potential, can it sustain itself in the short term? Can it cover its costs consistently? Because if it cannot, pressure builds, and pressure forces bad decisions. This is where many people fail, not because the idea was bad, but because the timing and structure were weak. So you must ask, if this underperforms, can I still hold it? Because survival is part of the strategy. Now, the third layer, control risk. How much influence do you have? Can you adjust? Can you improve performance? Can you respond to changes? Or are you completely dependent on external forces? Because the less control you have, the more unpredictable your outcome becomes. And unpredictability is where risk increases. Now here's a powerful realization. Risk decreases with knowledge and increases with emotion. Let that sit with you, because most people make financial decisions emotionally. Excitement, fear, urgency, comparison. They see someone else succeed, and they rush. They feel pressure, and they react. And that's where they lose, because emotion clouds judgment. Now think about this. How many decisions have you made in your life? Not because they were logical, but because they felt right in the moment? And how many of those decisions led to outcomes you didn't expect? That's emotional decision-making. And when you combine that with debt, it becomes dangerous. So discipline becomes your protection, not just discipline in action, but discipline in thinking, slowing down, evaluating, questioning, because every strong decision comes from clarity. Now let's go deeper, because here's something most people don't realize. Avoiding risk is also risky, because when you avoid everything, you limit growth, you miss opportunities. You stay in the same position year after year, and time quietly moves forward. So the real danger is not risk itself. It's unmanaged risk or misunderstood risk. Now here's a line to remember. Safe choices often lead to small lives. That doesn't mean reckless decisions. It means calculated ones, intentional ones, structured ones, because growth requires stepping into uncertainty, but doing it with awareness. Now let's bring this back to debt. When used without understanding, debt feels like a burden. But when used with clarity, it becomes a calculated tool. And the difference is risk management. Now pause and ask yourself honestly, do I avoid risk or do I understand it? Because your answer explains your current position and your future direction. Now here's where things get even more important, because understanding risk is not enough. You need systems, you need boundaries, you need rules that protect you even when emotions try to take over. And that's exactly where we're going next. Chapter 7. The rules, the non-negotiables, the structure that keeps you safe while allowing you to grow. Because freedom without structure turns into chaos, and structure is what separates builders from gamblers. Chapter 7. The rules that protect you from yourself. There is something most people don't want to admit. The biggest financial risk is not the market. It's not the economy. It's not the system. It's you, your impulses, your emotions, your decisions under pressure. Because even with the best strategy in the world, one undisciplined decision can undo everything. And when debt is involved, that mistake becomes amplified, faster, heavier, more painful. That's why rules matter, not suggestions, not ideas, rules, non-negotiables, boundaries you do not cross, no matter how you feel. Because feelings change, but consequences don't. So this chapter is about building your internal system, the structure that protects you, even when your emotions try to take control. Let's begin with the first rule: never use debt for ego. This is where most people fail. They don't admit it, but it's true. They borrow to look successful, to feel ahead, to impress, to escape insecurity, and that decision quietly destroys them, because ego-driven debt has no return. It only creates pressure. So ask yourself every time, am I doing this to grow or to be seen? Because if it's to be seen, walk away. Now the second rule: the asset must carry the debt, not you. This is critical, because if your personal income is the only thing supporting the debt, you are exposed. You are vulnerable. You are one disruption away from stress. But when the asset itself generates enough to cover the obligation, you create separation, protection, stability. This is the difference between being responsible for the debt and being supported by the structure, and that difference changes everything. Now the third rule: always leave margin. Never operate at the edge, because life is unpredictable, markets shift, income fluctuates, unexpected situations happen. And if your structure has no room, no buffer, no margin, even a small disruption can collapse everything. Margin is not weakness. It's intelligence, it's preparation, it's respect for reality. So never build something that only works in perfect conditions, because perfect conditions do not exist. Now the fourth rule: understand before you act. This sounds simple, but it's ignored constantly. People rush. They see opportunity. They feel urgency. They act without full understanding, and later they pay for that speed. So slow down, ask questions, study the structure, because speed without clarity is one of the fastest ways to lose. Now the fifth rule: do not mix consumption with investment. This is subtle, but dangerous, because the mind is very good at justifying desires. You will convince yourself that something is an investment when it's actually consumption. And once you blur that line, you lose control. So be honest, brutally honest. If it does not produce income, it is not an investment, no matter how you label it. Now the sixth rule: protect your downside first. Before you think about profit, think about survival, because staying in the game is more important than winning once. If you cannot survive mistakes, you cannot grow long term. So always ask, what is the worst case scenario? And can I handle it? If the answer is no, you are not ready. Now here's a powerful line: successful people don't avoid mistakes. They survive them. And survival is built through structure. Now the seventh rule: stay emotionally neutral. This is one of the hardest things to master, because money triggers emotion. Fear when things drop, excitement when things rise, urgency when opportunities appear. But emotion is not strategy, and decisions made in emotional states are rarely strong. So you must train yourself to step back, to observe, to think clearly even when pressure is high, because clarity is your advantage. Now pause for a moment and think about this. How many times in your life have you made a decision you knew wasn't right, but you did it anyway? That's the moment these rules are designed for. Not when things are easy, but when they're not. Because discipline is not tested in comfort, it's tested in pressure. Now here's something deeper. Rules are not limitations. They are protection. They give you freedom, because they prevent collapse. Without rules, you rely on emotion, and emotion is inconsistent. But with rules, you rely on structure, and structure is stable. Now let's bring this back to debt. When used without rules, debt becomes dangerous. But when used with discipline, it becomes controlled. And control is what turns risk into strategy. Now ask yourself, do I trust my emotions or do I follow structure? Because that answer determines everything. Now as we move forward, we are going to build on this because rules protect you, but awareness guides you. In Chapter 8, we step into one of the most overlooked ideas in this entire conversation, time. Because debt is not just about money, it's about timing, speed, acceleration, and understanding time will completely change how you see opportunity. Because those who win do not just understand money, they understand when to move and when to wait. Chapter 8. Time is the hidden currency. Most people think money is the most important resource. It's not. Time is, because money can be earned back. Time cannot. And once you understand that, everything about debt begins to look different. Because debt, when used wisely, is not just about money, it's about compressing time. Let me explain. Imagine two people. Both want to build something. Both have the same goal, the same ambition, the same vision. But one decides to wait. They save, they delay, they take the safe path. Slow accumulation, careful movement, year after year. And eventually, they get there. Now imagine the second person. They understand leverage. They understand structure. They use debt strategically. They access the same opportunity years earlier. They start sooner. They build faster. They learn faster. They grow faster. And over time, that difference becomes massive. Not because they were smarter, but because they understood time. Here's a line I want you to remember. Debt, when used wisely, is not about borrowing money. It's about buying time. And time is the one asset you can never create more of. Now pause, because this is where everything shifts. Most people think in terms of cost. How much will this cost me? But very few think in terms of time. How much time will this save me? Because waiting has a cost, a silent cost, a hidden cost. Every year you delay is a year of lost growth, lost experience, lost momentum, and momentum is everything. Because once something starts moving, it becomes easier to keep moving. But starting is always the hardest part. So when you use debt to accelerate that start, you are not just speeding up a process. You are entering the game earlier, and that changes your entire trajectory. Now let's go deeper, because time is not just about starting sooner. It's about compounding. Small advantages, repeated over time, create massive outcomes, and this is where people underestimate the power of early action. They think, I'll wait until I'm ready. I'll wait until I have enough. I'll wait until the timing is perfect. But here's the truth. Perfect timing doesn't exist, and waiting often becomes a habit, a comfortable delay, a quiet excuse. Now, this does not mean you rush. It does not mean you act blindly. It means you understand the value of starting with structure, with clarity, with intention. Because once you start, you begin learning, you begin adjusting, you begin improving, and those lessons are more valuable than time spent waiting. Now think about this. What has waiting cost you in your life? Opportunities you didn't take, decisions you delayed, moments you hesitated because you wanted certainty, because you wanted comfort, because you wanted to avoid risk. And what did that waiting give you? Safety? Maybe. But also stagnation, because growth does not happen in waiting. It happens in movement. Now let's bring this back to debt, because this is where people get confused. They think using debt is risky, but they ignore the risk of doing nothing, the risk of waiting too long, the risk of missing the window, because every opportunity has timing. Markets move, trends shift, conditions change, and if you're always late, you're always reacting, never leading. So the goal is not speed for the sake of speed, it's timing with awareness, moving when the structure is right, not when emotion pushes you, and not when fear holds you back. Now here's a powerful line. Those who understand time don't chase opportunities. They position themselves for them. And positioning is what leverage allows. Now let's go even deeper, because time is also connected to energy. Your energy, your focus, your capacity, because when you delay too long, you lose momentum, you lose clarity, you lose motivation. But when you act, even in small steps, you create movement, and movement creates direction. Now pause again. Ask yourself, am I waiting or am I preparing to move? Because there is a difference. Waiting is passive. Preparation is active. Waiting delays. Preparation builds. And if you're honest, you know which one you've been doing. Now here's the truth. Debt is not about escaping effort. It's about accelerating outcomes, but only when paired with discipline, only when paired with structure, only when paired with awareness. Otherwise, it becomes a shortcut. And shortcuts often lead to failure. So never use debt to avoid the process. Use it to enhance the process, to move faster, but still move correctly. Now let's bring this into focus, because everything we've covered so far leads to one powerful realization. You are not just managing money, you are managing time. And those who understand that build differently, think differently, move differently. Now, as we step into Chapter 9, we go deeper into something most people overlook: income itself. Because not all income is equal. Not all money works the same. And if you don't understand the difference, you will struggle, no matter how much you earn. So in the next chapter, we break down the different types of income and how debt connects to each one, because once you understand that, you will stop chasing money and start designing it. Chapter 9. Not all income is equal. Most people think income is simple. You earn money, you spend money, you save what's left. That's the cycle. That's what they've been taught. But here's the truth. That model keeps you limited, because not all income works the same way, and if you don't understand the difference, you will always work harder instead of smarter. So let's break this open, because this chapter changes how you see money itself. There are three primary types of income: active income, passive income, and leveraged income, and each one plays a completely different role in your life. Let's start with the first, active income. This is the most common, the most familiar, the most understood. You trade your time for money, a job, freelance work, hourly pay. You show up, you perform, you get paid. Simple, but limited, because your time is limited. There are only so many hours in a day, so no matter how hard you work, there is a ceiling, a cap, a limit you cannot break. And this is where most people stay, their entire lives, working more, trying to earn more, but always tied to time. Now here's the problem. When you rely only on active income, you are vulnerable. If you stop working, the income stops. If something changes, your stability is affected, and that creates pressure. Now let's move to the second type, passive income. This is where things begin to shift, because now your money is not directly tied to your time. An asset produces income, even when you are not actively working. It could be something that pays you regularly, something that operates without your constant involvement. This is where freedom begins, not when you earn more, but when you depend less on your time. Now here's the key. Passive income is not created by accident. It is built, structured, designed. And this is where debt becomes powerful, because instead of waiting years to build that asset slowly, you can access it sooner, accelerate the process, and begin generating income earlier. Now let's go to the third type, leveraged income. This is where everything multiplies, because now you are not just using your time, and you are not just using your assets. You are using systems, people, capital, to expand beyond your personal limits. This is where scale happens. This is where growth accelerates. This is where small efforts turn into large outcomes. And debt, when used correctly, is one of the core tools behind leveraged income, because it allows you to operate beyond your current resources, to control more without owning everything up front. Now pause, because this is where the shift becomes real. Most people spend their entire lives trying to increase active income, working harder, working longer, chasing promotions, chasing raises. But very few focus on building passive and leveraged income, and that's why they stay stuck, because effort alone does not create freedom. Structure does. Now, here's a powerful line. If your income depends only on your effort, your freedom will always be limited. Let that sit with you, because it's not about working less. It's about building smarter. Now let's connect this to debt, because this is where everything comes together. Debt should never be used to increase consumption. It should be used to shift your income structure from active to passive to leveraged. That is the path. That is the progression. And every step reduces dependence on your time. Now think about your current situation. Where does your income come from? How much of it is tied to your time? How much of it works without you? How much of it can grow without you doing more? Because your answers reveal your current structure and your future direction. Now here's something deeper, because this is not just about money. It's about control over your life. When your income depends only on your time, you are always trading, always exchanging, always limited. But when your income begins to detach from your time, you gain space, freedom, choice. And that is the real goal. Now here's where discipline comes back into play, because building this structure requires patience. It requires delayed gratification. It requires saying no to things that feel good now for something greater later. And most people struggle with that, because the world is built on instant rewards. But real growth is built on long-term thinking. Now ask yourself, am I building income or am I building a system? Because income alone can disappear, but systems sustain. Now here's the truth. Debt is not the goal. Income is not the goal. Freedom is the goal. And everything we are building leads to that. Now as we move into chapter 10, we step into something even more practical. Application. Real-world thinking. How to start. How to evaluate your current position. How to begin shifting from where you are to where you want to be. Because understanding means nothing without action. And in the next chapter, we begin turning knowledge into movement. Chapter 10, From Understanding to Action. There is a moment that separates people who listen from people who change. It's not when they hear something powerful. It's not when they feel motivated. It's the moment they decide to act. Because understanding without action is just information. And information alone does not change your life. So this chapter is where everything begins to shift. From thinking to doing. From awareness to movement. But before you rush forward, we need to ground this, because action without clarity is just another mistake. So let's start here. Where are you right now? Not where you want to be, not where you pretend to be, where you actually are, financially, emotionally, structurally, because if you don't know your starting point, you cannot build a path forward. So ask yourself, what is my current income structure? How much is active? How much is passive? How much is leveraged? What are my current obligations? What am I already committed to? What is my margin? What is my flexibility? Because awareness starts with honesty, and honesty is not always comfortable, but it is necessary. Now here's the next step. Clarity, not vague goals, not I want more money, not I want freedom, clear direction. What are you trying to build? An additional income stream, a scalable system, a long-term asset? Because without direction, action becomes scattered, and scattered action creates weak results. Now here's a powerful line. Clarity turns effort into progress. So take your time here, because this is the foundation. Now once you have clarity, we move to evaluation. And this is where most people skip steps. They jump straight into action without evaluating opportunities properly. And that's where mistakes happen. So slow down. Every opportunity you consider must pass your filter. Does it generate income? Is that income consistent? Do I understand how it works? Can it sustain itself? Do I have control? If the answer to any of these is unclear, you do not proceed. You learn, you analyze, you wait. Because waiting with awareness is different from waiting with fear. Now here's where discipline becomes real, because opportunities will appear. Some will look exciting, some will feel urgent, some will promise fast results, and your job is not to react, it's to evaluate. Because reacting is emotional, evaluating is strategic. Now let's talk about starting small, because many people think they need to make a big move, a big investment, a big leap. They think scale comes first. It doesn't. Understanding comes first. So your first step is not to go all in. It's to go in intelligently, to test, to observe, to learn. Because small, controlled action builds confidence, builds experience, builds awareness, and that foundation allows you to scale later. Now here's something important. Do not confuse movement with progress, because you can be busy without building anything meaningful. So every action you take must connect to your structure, must move you closer to your goal. Now pause and ask yourself, am I acting or am I just staying busy? Because those are two very different things. Now let's bring this back to debt, because this is where responsibility becomes real. Debt should never be your first move. Understanding is, structure is, clarity is, debt comes after. When the system is clear, when the asset is defined, when the risk is managed, that's when you introduce leverage, not before. Now here's a powerful line. Leverage without structure is not acceleration. It's collapse waiting to happen. So be patient. Be intentional, because speed without direction leads nowhere. Now let's talk about commitment, because starting is easy. Continuing is hard. Staying disciplined is hard. Staying focused is hard. And that's where most people fall off, not because they lack knowledge, but because they lack consistency. And consistency is what builds results, not intensity, not motivation. Consistency, showing up, even when it's boring, even when it's slow, even when results are not immediate, because real growth is not exciting every day. It's structured, it's repetitive, it's disciplined. Now here's something deeper, because this journey is not just financial, it's personal. You are changing how you think, how you decide, how you operate, and that requires identity shift. You are no longer just someone who earns and spends. You are becoming someone who builds, who structures, who leverages, and that identity changes everything. Now, if something in this chapter is hitting you, if you feel that shift, take a moment. Make a decision, not a big one, a real one, a decision to start thinking differently, to start acting intentionally, to stop drifting, because drifting is what keeps people stuck. Now, as we move forward, we are going deeper into reality, because everything so far has been structure and mindset. But in Chapter 11, we step into something most people don't expect. Mistakes. Real mistakes. The ones people make when using debt. The ones that destroy progress. The ones that trap people for years. Because learning what to do is only half the game. Learning what to avoid is just as important. And what you're about to hear next might save you from the most expensive mistakes of your life. If you enjoy these audiobooks and want to support the channel, consider joining our private members community. Members get early access to new audiobooks and exclusive wealth lessons. Chapter 11. The Mistakes That Cost Years. There is something you need to understand clearly. Most people don't fail because they lack opportunity. They fail because they repeat avoidable mistakes. Small ones, silent ones. The kind that don't look dangerous at first, but over time, they compound. And when debt is involved, those mistakes become expensive, not just financially, emotionally, mentally, even physically, because pressure builds, stress accumulates, and clarity disappears. So this chapter is about awareness, because if you can see the mistakes before they happen, you can avoid them, and avoiding one major mistake can save you years. Let's begin with the first one, using debt without a clear plan. This is the most common and the most dangerous. People borrow money before they fully understand how they will use it. They think they'll figure it out later. They rely on optimism, on hope. On it should work. But hope is not a strategy. And when reality hits, they are left with obligation, without structure, and that's where things begin to fall apart. So here's the rule. Never take on debt before you know exactly how it will produce income. Not roughly, not I have an idea. Exactly. Now the second mistake. Overestimating returns. This one is subtle, because when people see opportunity, they naturally imagine the best outcome. They calculate profits based on ideal conditions. Everything works, everything flows, everything grows. But reality is rarely perfect. There are delays, unexpected costs, lower returns, and when those are not accounted for, the structure breaks. So always be conservative, always assume less, because if it performs better, that's a bonus. But if you rely on perfection, you will struggle. Now, the third mistake, underestimating time. This is critical because even good ideas take time to work, to stabilize, to produce consistent income. But people expect fast results, immediate returns, quick success. And when that doesn't happen, they panic. They make emotional decisions. They exit too early or double down incorrectly. And both lead to loss. So remember this. Time is part of the investment, not something separate, something built into the process. Now, the fourth mistake, lack of margin. We touched on this before, but it needs to be reinforced because many people operate too close to the edge. They build structures that only work if everything goes perfectly. But life doesn't work like that. And when something unexpected happens, there is no buffer, no flexibility, no space to adjust. And that's when pressure takes over. So always leave room. Always build with margin, because margin is what keeps you in the game. Now, the fifth mistake, letting emotion drive decisions. This one destroys more progress than anything else. Fear, excitement, urgency, comparison, all of these push people into decisions that don't align with their structure. They see others succeed, and they rush. They feel pressure, and they react. They experience loss, and they panic. And in those moments, they abandon logic. They abandon discipline, and that's where mistakes multiply. So your goal is not to remove emotion. It's to control it, to recognize it without letting it decide for you. Now, the sixth mistake, confusing movement with progress. This one is dangerous because it feels productive. You're doing things, taking action, making moves. But not all movement leads to growth. Some movement is just noise, distraction, activity without direction. So always ask, is this moving me closer to my structure or just keeping me busy? Because clarity filters action. Now, the seventh mistake, ignoring worst-case scenarios. Most people don't like thinking about negative outcomes. It feels uncomfortable, it feels pessimistic, but ignoring them does not remove them. It just leaves you unprepared. And when something goes wrong, you're caught off guard. So instead, face it directly. Ask yourself, what is the worst thing that could happen? And how would I handle it? Because preparation reduces fear and increases control. Now here's a powerful line. Confidence is not believing nothing will go wrong. It's knowing you can handle it if it does. Let that stay with you, because that's real strength. Now pause and think about this. Which of these mistakes feels familiar, not in theory, in your life? Because awareness starts with honesty, and honesty creates change. Now here's something deeper. Mistakes are not the problem, repeating them is. Because every mistake carries a lesson, a signal, a piece of information, and if you pay attention, you improve, you adapt, you grow. But if you ignore it, you repeat it, and repetition creates patterns, and patterns create outcomes. So your goal is not perfection, it's awareness. Now let's bring this back to debt, because debt magnifies everything, the good and the bad. So when you make a mistake, it feels bigger, it hits harder, and that's why discipline matters. That's why structure matters. That's why awareness matters. Because when those are in place, mistakes become manageable, not destructive. Now ask yourself, am I learning from my mistakes or repeating them? Because that answer determines your direction. Now, as we move forward, we shift into something even more practical. because understanding mistakes is protection, but building systems is power. In Chapter 12, we begin designing your structure, your approach, your path forward, because everything you've learned so far now needs to come together into something real, something actionable, something you can actually build. And that's where things get exciting, because knowledge is about to turn into creation. Chapter 12. Build the structure before you scale. This is where everything begins to come together. Because up until now, you've been learning how to think, how to evaluate, how to avoid mistakes. But now, we shift into creation, because knowledge without structure does nothing, and structure is what turns ideas into results. So this chapter is about building your foundation, not rushing, not chasing, building step by step with clarity, with intention, with control. Let's begin with the most important truth. You don't rise to your goals. You fall to your systems. Let that sink in, because goals are temporary. They motivate you for a moment, but systems carry you long term. And if your system is weak, no goal will save you. Now here's the first step. Define your entry point. Where do you start? Not based on what sounds exciting, not based on what others are doing, based on your reality, your current position, your resources, your knowledge, your risk tolerance. Because the strongest structure is the one that fits you, not someone else. Now here's where people make a mistake. They try to copy. They see someone else succeed, and they follow the same path without understanding the context, the timing, the experience behind it. And that leads to failure. Because what works for someone else might not work for you. So your job is not to copy. It's to build. Now the second step. Start with one system, not 5, not 10. One. Because focus creates depth, and depth creates mastery. Trying to do everything at once leads to confusion, scattered effort, weak results. So choose one direction, one structure, and go deep. Understand it, refine it, stabilize it, because once one system works, you can build another. Now the third step, test before you scale. This is critical, because many people want to go big immediately. They want fast results, fast growth, fast expansion, but without testing, you don't know what actually works. You only assume, and assumptions are dangerous. So start small, controlled, measured. Observe what happens, adjust, improve, because small mistakes are manageable, large mistakes are costly. Now here's a powerful line. Scale amplifies structure. If the structure is weak, scale amplifies failure. So never rush to scale. Earn the right to scale. Now the fourth step. Track everything, your numbers, your performance, your outcomes, because what you don't track, you don't understand. And what you don't understand, you cannot improve. So remove guesswork, replace it with data, clarity, reality, because numbers do not lie. Now the fifth step, refine continuously. This is not a one-time process. It's ongoing. You adjust, you optimize, you improve, because conditions change, markets shift, opportunities evolve, and your system must adapt. Now pause and think about this. Are you building something that can grow, or something that only works for now? Because short-term thinking creates fragile structures, but long-term thinking creates stability. Now let's go deeper, because structure is not just external, it's internal. Your habits, your discipline, your consistency, because no system survives without the right behavior behind it. You can have the perfect plan, but if you don't execute consistently, it fails. So your personal discipline becomes part of the structure. Now here's something important. Do not expect perfection. Expect progress. Because progress builds confidence. Confidence builds momentum, and momentum builds results. Now let's bring this back to debt, because this is where everything connects. Debt should enter your system only after the structure is proven, only after the process is clear, only after you understand how it works. Because debt is not for testing, it's for scaling. Let me repeat that. Debt is not for testing, it's for scaling. That line can protect you from massive mistakes, because if you use debt too early, you are gambling. But if you use it at the right time, you are leveraging. Now ask yourself, am I ready to scale or am I still learning? Because that answer determines your next move. Now here's something deeper. Building a system requires patience, and patience is rare, because we live in a world that rewards speed, instant results, quick wins, but real growth takes time. And those who understand that win long term. Now take a moment. If this is resonating with you, commit to something simple. Not a big decision, a real one. A decision to build instead of chase, to focus instead of scatter, to think instead of react. Because those small decisions change everything. Now, as we move into chapter 13, we go deeper into something that determines your success more than anything else. Consistency. Because building once is not enough. Acting once is not enough. Understanding once is not enough. It's what you do repeatedly that defines your results. And in the next chapter, we break down how to build that consistency, even when motivation disappears, even when things get hard, because that's where real growth happens. Chapter 13. Consistency is the real advantage. There is a truth most people don't want to hear. Success is not built on intensity, it's built on repetition. Small actions, done consistently, over time. That's it. No secret, no shortcut, no hidden formula. And yet, this is where most people fail. Not because they don't know what to do, but because they don't keep doing it. They start strong, motivated, focused, excited. But then, life happens. Energy drops. Distractions appear. Results take longer than expected. And slowly, they stop. Not all at once, little by little, until the momentum is gone. And when momentum disappears, everything feels harder. Now here's the shift. Consistency is not about feeling motivated, it's about showing up. Even when you don't feel like it, especially when you don't feel like it. Because discipline is what carries you when motivation fades. And motivation always fades. So if your progress depends on how you feel, you will always struggle. But if your progress depends on what you do, regardless of how you feel, you become unstoppable. Now let's connect this to everything we've built so far. Understanding debt, understanding assets, understanding risk, understanding structure, all of that means nothing without consistent action, because knowledge without repetition does not create results. Now here's a powerful line. Consistency turns small advantages into unstoppable momentum. Let that sink in, because you don't need massive moves, you need repeated moves, done correctly, over time. Now let's make this real. Imagine building an income-generating system. At first, it's slow, uncertain, small. You're learning, adjusting, testing. It doesn't feel impressive. It doesn't look like success. And that's where most people quit. because they want visible results, fast. But the truth is, the early stage is always invisible, quiet, unnoticed. And that's where consistency matters most, because if you stay with it, if you keep refining, if you keep improving, something shifts, momentum builds, results begin to appear, and once momentum starts, everything becomes easier. Now pause and ask yourself, do I stop when things get hard, or do I stay until things get clear? Because that answer defines your path. Now here's something deeper. Consistency is not just about action, it's about identity. Who you are when no one is watching, when no one is pushing you, when there is no immediate reward. Because real growth happens in those moments, and that's where most people fall off. Because they rely on external pressure, deadlines, expectations, validation, but when those disappear, so does their effort. So you must build internal consistency, a standard, a personal expectation that you meet no matter what. Now let's bring this back to debt, because this is where things become serious. When you use debt, you create obligation, responsibility, structure, and that structure requires consistency, because the system must operate regularly, reliably, predictably, and if your behavior is inconsistent, the system becomes unstable. So consistency is not optional, it's required. Now here's a powerful realization. Discipline is what makes leverage safe. Without discipline, leverage becomes dangerous, because inconsistency breaks structure. Now let's talk about habits. Because consistency is built through habits, not willpower, not motivation, habits. What you do daily, without thinking, without resistance. Because habits reduce friction. They make action automatic. And when action is automatic, consistency becomes easier. So your goal is not to push yourself harder every day. It's to build habits that carry you forward. Now here's something important. Start small. Because many people try to change everything at once. They set big goals, big expectations, and they burn out. But small, consistent actions are sustainable. They build over time. They compound. So don't aim for perfection. Aim for consistency. Now ask yourself, what is one action I can repeat daily that moves me forward? Not 10, not 20. One. Because one action, done consistently, creates progress. Now here's a deeper truth. Consistency is not exciting. It's not glamorous. It's not something people celebrate. But it's what builds everything. Quietly, relentlessly, over time. Now let's connect this to your future. Because where you are in 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, will not be determined by one decision. It will be determined by what you do repeatedly, every day. And that's where your power lies, not in big moments, but in daily actions. Now take a moment. Reflect on your current habits. What are you repeating? What patterns are you reinforcing? Because your habits are building your future right now, whether you realize it or not. Now here's a line to remember. You don't rise occasionally. You rise consistently. And if you want a different outcome, you need a different pattern. Now, as we move into chapter 14, we step into something even more powerful. Focus. Because consistency without direction leads nowhere. You can work hard, stay disciplined, stay consistent, and still not get results if your focus is scattered. So in the next chapter, we break down how to focus your energy, your attention, your effort on what actually matters. Because focus is what turns consistency into results. Chapter 14. Focus is your force multiplier. You can have knowledge, you can have discipline, you can even have opportunity, and still go nowhere. Because without focus, energy gets scattered, effort gets diluted, time gets wasted. And this is where many people quietly fail. Not because they are lazy, not because they lack potential, but because they are divided, pulled in too many directions, trying to do too many things, chasing too many ideas, and when everything matters, nothing truly moves. So this chapter is about alignment, bringing your attention, your energy, your decisions into one clear direction, because focus is what turns effort into results. Let's start with a simple truth. You don't need more time. You need fewer distractions. Let that sit with you, because most people don't lack time. They lack clarity. They lack direction. They lack boundaries. And because of that, their energy leaks everywhere. Now think about your day. How much of your time is truly focused, not busy, not occupied, focused? Because there is a difference. Being busy feels productive, but focus creates progress. Now here's where things get real. We live in a world designed to distract you. Notifications, social media, endless information, constant noise, and every time your attention shifts, your progress slows, because focus requires depth, and depth requires time. So if your attention is constantly broken, your results will always be shallow. Now let's connect this to everything we've built. Understanding debt, building systems, creating income. All of this requires focus, because you are not just learning something new. You are building something real. And building requires attention, sustained attention. Now here's a powerful line. Where your focus goes, your results follow. So if your focus is scattered, your results will be scattered. If your focus is sharp, your results will be clear. Now let's break this down practically. First, you need to eliminate noise. Not all information is useful. Not all opportunities are real. Not all advice applies to you. And if you try to absorb everything, you lose direction. So be selective. Protect your attention, because attention is one of your most valuable resources. Now, second, you need to define your priority. What matters most right now? Not everything. One thing. Because progress comes from depth, not from spreading yourself thin. So choose your focus and commit to it. Now, third, you need to create boundaries. Time boundaries, energy boundaries, mental boundaries. Because without boundaries, distractions will take over. And distractions are endless. So decide what you allow in your space and what you keep out. Now here's something deeper. Focus is not just external, it's internal. Your thoughts, your mindset, your emotional state. Because even if your environment is quiet, if your mind is scattered, you still won't progress. So you must train your mind to stay on track, to return to the task, to ignore unnecessary noise. Now pause and ask yourself, where is my attention going every day? Because your attention is shaping your future. Now let's bring this back to debt, because this is where focus becomes critical. When you use debt, you are committing to a structure, a system, a process, and that process requires your attention, your management, your awareness. Because if you lose focus, you lose control. And when control is lost, problems begin. So focus becomes your protection. It keeps you aligned. It keeps you aware. It keeps you in control. Now here's a powerful realization. Distraction is the silent enemy of growth. Not failure, not lack of knowledge, distraction, because it pulls you away from what matters, slowly, quietly, until progress stops. Now think about this. How many times have you started something with full intention, but lost focus along the way? Not because it didn't matter, but because something else took your attention. That's the pattern, and that pattern must change. Now here's how you begin. Simplify. Remove unnecessary complexity. Focus on what matters, and ignore the rest, because clarity creates direction, and direction creates results. Now let's go even deeper, because focus is not just about what you do, it's about what you ignore, the opportunities you don't chase, the distractions you don't engage with, the noise you don't listen to, because every yes costs you attention, and attention is limited. So be intentional. Now here's a line to remember. You don't achieve more by doing more. You achieve more by focusing better. Let that guide you, because it will save you time, energy, effort. Now take a moment. If this is resonating, make a simple commitment, not to do more, but to focus better, to protect your attention, to direct your energy, because that shift changes everything. Now as we move into chapter 15, we step into something even more personal, your environment, because your environment shapes your behavior, your thinking, your decisions, and if your environment is not aligned, your progress becomes harder. So in the next, hang on a sec, write in the comments what you'd like us to talk about in the next video. We promise to read all the comments and pick the best and most relevant topics. Thanks. We break down how to build an environment that supports your growth instead of working against it, because success is not just built internally, it's supported externally. Chapter 15. Your environment is either lifting you or limiting you. There is something most people underestimate. They believe success is only internal. Mindset, discipline, focus. And while all of that matters, there is another force working quietly in the background. Your environment, the people around you. The conversations you hear, the habits you see, the expectations that surround you, all of it shapes how you think, how you act, how you decide, and if your environment is not aligned with your growth, it will pull you back. Slowly, subtly, but consistently. So this chapter is about awareness, because once you see it, you can change it. Let's begin with a simple truth. You don't rise alone, and you don't stay stuck alone. Your environment plays a role in both. Now think about this. If you are surrounded by people who fear debt, who avoid risk, who think small, who stay comfortable, what happens to your thinking? It shrinks. Not because you're weak, but because repetition shapes belief. You hear the same ideas over and over, and eventually they feel true, even if they're not. Now here's the challenge. Growth often requires you to think differently before your environment reflects it, which means, at first, you will feel out of place. You will feel misunderstood. You will feel resistance. And that's normal, because you are changing direction. Now let's go deeper. Your environment is not just people. It's information. What you watch, what you listen to, what you consume daily, because input shapes output. If you constantly consume noise, distraction, surface-level thinking, that becomes your mindset. But if you consume clarity, structure, growth-focused content, that shapes you differently. Now here's a powerful line. You become what you are consistently exposed to. So the question is, what are you exposing yourself to? Because that answer explains your current thinking. Now let's connect this to everything we've built. Using debt wisely requires a different mindset, a different approach, a different level of awareness. And if your environment does not support that, you will constantly feel pulled back, second-guessing yourself, doubting your decisions, returning to old patterns. So you must become intentional about your environment. Now, this does not mean you cut everyone off. It means you become aware of influence. You choose what shapes you. You decide what you allow in your space, because influence is powerful. Now let's talk about physical environment, your workspace, your daily surroundings. Because clutter creates distraction, distraction reduces focus, and reduced focus slows progress. So simplify, create a space that supports clarity, that supports focus, that supports action, because your environment should work with you, not against you. Now let's talk about people, because this is where it becomes real. Who you spend time with matters, not in a judgmental way, in a practical way. Are they growing? Are they thinking differently? Are they disciplined? Or are they comfortable, reactive, stuck in the same patterns? Because energy transfers, mindsets influence. And if you are constantly surrounded by limitation, it becomes harder to expand. Now here's something important. You don't need everyone to understand your path. You need to understand it. Because growth is often quiet, private, unseen. And not everyone will relate. That's okay. You are not building your life based on others' understanding. You are building it based on your vision. Now here's a powerful realization. Your environment will either support your discipline or test it constantly. And if it's constantly testing you, you will get tired, because resistance drains energy. So your goal is not to eliminate all challenges. It's to reduce unnecessary friction, to create a space where growth feels natural. Now pause and ask yourself, is my environment helping me grow or holding me back? Be honest, because honesty creates change. Now here's something deeper. Sometimes you are the environment, your own habits, your own patterns, your own routines. Because even if everything around you is perfect, if your internal environment is chaotic, you will still struggle. So you must align both, external and internal. Now, let's bring this back to debt, because this is where responsibility becomes real. When you start using leverage, when you start thinking differently, you need support, not necessarily from people, but from your environment, from your structure, from your habits, because this path requires consistency, focus, discipline, and your environment either makes that easier or harder. Now here's a line to remember. You don't need a perfect environment. You need a supportive one. And that support starts with awareness. Now take a moment. If this is resonating, make a simple decision. Adjust one thing, one habit, one input, one space, because small changes create big shifts over time. Now, as we move into chapter 16, we go even deeper into something that determines your long-term success. Patience, because everything you are building requires time, and without patience, you will sabotage your own progress. So in the next chapter, we break down how to stay grounded, how to stay committed, and how to trust the process, even when results are not immediate, because that's where most people quit, and that's where you separate yourself. chapter 16. Patience is the discipline no one talks about. There is a silent reason why most people never succeed long-term. It's not lack of intelligence, it's not lack of opportunity, it's not even lack of effort, it's lack of patience. Because in a world built on speed, patience feels like weakness. Everything around you moves fast. Information, content, money, results. You see people winning overnight. You see success stories compressed into minutes. You see outcomes without seeing the process behind them. And slowly, your expectations change. You start believing that progress should be fast, that results should be immediate, that growth should be visible. And when it's not, you feel like you're failing. But here's the truth. Anything real takes time. Let that settle in. Because everything we've been building in this audiobook requires time, understanding, structure, systems, income, leverage. None of it happens instantly. And that's where patience becomes your advantage. Because most people will not stay long enough to see results. They start, they try, they expect, and when results don't come quickly, they quit, or they switch, or they chase something new, and that pattern keeps them stuck, forever restarting, never building. Now here's the shift. Patience is not waiting passively. It's working consistently, without immediate reward. It's staying committed when progress is invisible. It's trusting the process, even when results are delayed. That's real patience. Now let's connect this to everything you've learned. Using debt wisely, building assets, creating income, structuring systems. All of this requires time to stabilize, time to grow, time to compound. And if you rush it, you break it, because growth forced too quickly becomes unstable. Now here's a powerful line. Rushing destroys what patience builds, because when you rush, you skip steps, you ignore structure, you take shortcuts, and shortcuts often lead to collapse. Now think about this. How many times have you started something and abandoned it too early? Not because it didn't work, but because it didn't work fast enough? That's impatience. And that impatience costs more than failure itself, because it prevents you from ever seeing results. Now take a breath and ask yourself honestly, what is one decision I will make today that aligns with everything I've learned? Not tomorrow, not next week, today, because action begins now. Now here's something important. This journey does not end here. It continues every day, in every decision, in every action. Because this is not just about money. It's about how you live, how you think, how you move. Now, if this audiobook shifted something in you, if a line stayed with you, if a thought challenged you, then don't let it fade. Write it down. Remember it. Apply it. Because awareness without action disappears. Now here's your moment. Make it real. If this resonated with you, make a personal contract, not publicly, not for attention, for yourself, a decision to think differently, to act intentionally, to build with discipline, because that commitment is where everything begins. And if you want to go one step further, share this with someone who needs it, because sometimes one idea at the right moment can change everything. Now here's the final line, the one I want you to remember long after this ends. Use debt wisely, and it will build your future. Use it blindly, and it will control your life. The choice has always been yours, and it still is. Now the question is, what will you do with it?